In Essential Task 110B, we will be wrapping up our unit on cognition, and more specifically finishing our discussion of memory. In the previous Essential Task, 110A done in class, we talked about how the encoding and storage process are affected by a series of memory principles. In Essential Task 110B, we will be wrapping up our discussion of memory by highlighting the various influences and principles during the retrieval or the remembering phase of memory. This concept map consists of what you see under the B. So there are 2 boxes under improving, and then 6 boxes under the forgetting region. I recommend a horizontal concept map, as you just saw for this concept map. So I'll give you a moment now to finish copying that down. You can pause the video before we transition onward into the concept map. So similar to 110A, we will be talking about various principles during the retrieval process. We'll first be talking about the 2 boxes to the left underneath improving. The first is a concept that we call context-dependent memory. There are 2 different types of context-dependent memory. That's why you'll notice the 3 periods at the end of the definition, because it's leading you towards the 2 boxes within the table. Context-dependent memory means we are more likely to recall or retrieve information dependent on the scenario, and there are 2 scenarios where this plays out. The first is what we call location dependent. You might see this called location dependent memory. According to location dependent memory, research suggests that if you learn material in one place, you are more likely to retrieve and recall that information effectively if you do that task in the same place that you learned it. So for example, if you learn material in my classroom and take a test in my classroom, that congruent location is going to benefit your overall retrieval process. We call that location-dependent memory. Research has shown that even if you learn information in really abnormal locations, you're still more likely to retrieve that information in the abnormal location if that's where testing occurs. The chart that you see in front of you illustrates a study where they divided people up into one of 4 conditions. You learn information underwater, you take a test on land, you learn information on land, you take the test underwater. Those are the blue columns, or the red columns. And you would notice that both of the red columns have a higher percentage of words recalled on the memory task in this study. That even if you learned information underwater, if you were also tested underwater, you would actually score higher than either of the 2 blue categories. And then land would be the highest of all 4. This study suggests that the location that you learn information, if it matches the location where you were tested, it can greatly benefit your overall memory. Additionally, we call what's called mood-dependent memory, meaning that if your mood is consistent with your mood when you first studied, you're more likely to remember that information. So if you've ever had a really bad day, you might find yourself distracted and unable to focus on a test, even though you studied for that test, and in theory, you should do well on that test. The issue there is that your mood is not consistent and congruent between your study session and the testing session. If your mood is inconsistent relative to when you studied, you might find that your retrieval on that day is just simply ineffective. So if you study happy and test upset, you might end up getting really poor results. In theory, you want to study in a pretty lax, normal, average mood, and then also test during those same conditions. If you can ensure that, you would be relying on what's called mood-dependent memory, and your overall retrieval process would likely be better. If the term context-dependent memory is an FRQ, whether in this class or on the AP exam, you're able to talk about either location or mood, but you really should identify which of the 2 that you're describing and then address it properly. Location-dependent memory, we want the location of studying and testing to be the same. With mood-dependent memory, we want the mood that you have when you studied and the mood that you have when you take the test to also be congruent or the same. And moving on to the second term underneath improving. One thing that can help spur retrieval of information is when the question that is being asked has a lot of what we call retrieval cues. Retrieval cues are hints that sort of jog your memory and allow you to retrieve information that is in long-term memory, but you might be struggling to recall or retrieve at any given moment. Multiple choice questions tend to have a lot of retrieval cues, meaning the context of the question and the way it is worded tends to provide a lot of information and context to the reader. And as a result, there are a lot of cues within the question that might jog your memory regarding the proper answer. So for example, if you're trying to identify the word fire truck and for whatever reason it's escaping you, You might see the word smoke, and then all of a sudden that triggers as a retrieval cue and jogs your memory, and next thing you know, you're able to recall or retrieve the word fire truck. Multiple choice questions, again, tend to have a lot of retrieval cues. FRQ questions might have some, but not nearly as many. FRQs often require you to recall through what's called free recall and use entirely your long-term memory without a lot of hints, without a lot of retrieval cues. Continuing onward, we're going to talk about the boxes underneath the forgetting portion of this concept map. And we're going to end this unit by talking about some of the reasons why you might forget information. The first thing we're going to talk about is a phenomenon called interference. The two definitions that we are about to talk about back to back can seem similar, and they're basically just opposites of one another. But I do have a mnemonic that will hopefully help differentiate these for you. Proactive interference occurs when old information learned earlier in life is interfering with your ability to learn new information, and it's confusing you, for example, on a test. So, for example, let's say you spent your 9th, 10th, and 11th grade learning French, and for whatever reason you decide to learn Spanish your 12th grade year. If you're taking a Spanish test and you're struggling to conjugate a word because you can't get that French that you learned years ago out of your head, you're experiencing what's called proactive interference. This happens a lot when you have to change your password. Has anyone ever had to change their email password? And all of a sudden you sit down to log into HBO or your email and you start typing in old passwords, and for whatever reason that's the only thing stuck in your mind? That's an experience of what's called proactive interference. You're trying to learn new information. However, old information that's usually pretty similar is seemingly interfering with your ability to really retain and retrieve that new information. This again works with passwords to accounts, to email addresses, to HBO, Hulu, Netflix, etc. It works when you're talking about learning different languages. Alternatively, this school has undergone a lot of changes this year. If you find yourself struggling to remember the new locations of your teachers, you're also experiencing proactive interference. Your 3 previous years at Apponequet and the information about the school layout is interfering with your understanding of the new information regarding locations. Perhaps you have a new parking spot this year and you keep parking in your old spot. All of those are examples of what we call proactive interference. I'm going to give you sort of a quick demonstration. I'm not there with you to see your results, but what I'd like you to do is I'm going to flash a series of words in front of you, and I'd like for you to say the color of the font as fast as you can. So chances are that was pretty difficult. You know, you look at the word red, but it's technically printed in blue. Yellow is technically in green, and then red, and then yellow, and then green, and then red, and then blue, and then red, and then yellow. I mean, that was pretty challenging. I probably made a mistake. The reason that's challenging is you have 17 or 18 years of prior knowledge about how to read in the English language, and you do not read the font color. You read the word. So it's not like you're looking at this slide and you go, red, white, red. You read the words. So all of your previous experiences, how to read, are interfering with your ability to grasp this new information, this new task that I've presented in front of you. We call that phenomenon where old experiences or old information or old techniques interfere with your ability to retrieve something new. It's called proactive interference. The opposite is what we call retroactive interference. So this is the total opposite. This is when somebody asks you, hey, do you remember 5 years ago? What was your homeroom? And you say, oh, wait a minute. I don't remember my homeroom from 5 years ago, because all of a sudden you've had all of these new years and potentially new homerooms that are interfering with your ability to remember that information. Or maybe I could ask you, who were your teachers your freshman year? Freshman year, that was easy to answer. But now you have your senior, your junior, and your sophomore years blocking your ability to remember that older information. So all this new information about your teachers now, their locations now, could be blocking your ability to retrieve that information from years ago. This is the total opposite. We call this retroactive interference. It's when all of the new stuff that you've been learning interferes when somebody asks you about years ago or about last year's class. So you're taking French now, and somebody asks you, hey, do you remember how to conjugate this in Spanish? And you say, oh no, I just remember the French I've been learning. I have no idea what last year was like. That's retroactive interference. As a mnemonic, this will help explain some of the advice videos that I showed you at the beginning of the year. These two words are on the AP exam a ton, and they're very easy to confuse with one another. incredibly easy to confuse with one another. So I have this mnemonic here in the bottom left corner. So this is right below the 2 boxes that we just did. You can kind of position it a little bit more to the right or where you have space, but it's super effective. If you write these words in this order, proactive, old, retroactive, new, and you always remember the question, why am I confused? What is interfering with my memory? With proactive interference, the first term we talked about, it was old memories. So your old classrooms, your old phone number, your old email address, password is interfering with your ability to remember new stuff. So that's proactive. You associate P in proactive with the O in old. The second term that we just talked about, retroactive interference, is the complete opposite. That's when you've had a whole new schedule, a whole senior year schedule, and somebody asks you about freshman year, and you're like, wow, it's been 4 years. I've had all of this new information, and I once remembered my freshman schedule, but I just can't anymore. That's retroactive interference. You take the R in retroactive and the N in new, because new stuff is causing you to be confused. And you have the R and the N, and when you put those 4 letters together, it spells a 4-letter word that's a little silly. But if you remember that 4-letter word, you will always be able to put into the order these 4 terms. And if you remember the phrase, that red phrase at the top is really important. Why am I confused? With proactive, old stuff is confusing you. With retroactive, new stuff is confusing you. And if you can do that, you can hopefully work with these terms effectively, because otherwise they can be easily confused with one another. Progressing onward to the final portion of Unit 10, we're going to be identifying some different forms of amnesia. The first is what we call anterograde amnesia, which occurs when an individual is unable to form new memories. So there's no ability to form new memories. We'll identify in just a moment, but a brain region has been damaged. And now this person has all of their previous memories. So the past 17 or 18 years of your life is still intact. But going forward, you're going to live in a short-term memory window where after every 30 seconds, you have trouble transferring that from short into long-term memory. There's some type of issue at that point. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word anterograde, I identify that letter N. This is going to oppose in just a moment retrograde. The word retrograde does not have the letter N in it. So because anterograde has a letter N in it, I remember this 2-word phrase, back-to-back N's, no new. So when I look at anterograde, I see that second letter, that letter N, and I always think no new memories. If you remember this definition as no new memories, perfect. Dory from Finding Nemo and the movie 50 First Dates are both representations of anterograde amnesia. Neither of them really do it properly, but nevertheless, if you are familiar with those movies, they do in some capacity illustrate no new memories. If anterograde amnesia is no new memories, retrograde amnesia is the opposite, no old memories. So this might occur after some type of brain injury from a car accident or a collision in football, and as a result, the individual loses some capacity, their previous memories. So they can form new memories. So going forward, they're able to remember what they did that day. Individuals are able to add information from their experiences. But previous, what they did on their 10th birthday, those older memories might be lost. So they are unable, or they have an inability to retrieve older memories. As a mnemonic, the word retro means old, so I usually connect the word retro and old. And I can usually differentiate these two pretty easy. No new, I isolate that letter N. I see retro, and I think no old. Doing so can help differentiate anterograde and retrograde amnesia. We're going to proceed below to brain structures and then end all the way on the right. We are going to do that, so I'll go back to source amnesia in a moment. We're going to do this brain structure. It's the furthest below the boxes go. Identify a brain region that's a bit of a preview of a later unit. But this is so connected to memory that I think it's important to reference. We will reference it again later on this year, though. The hippocampus is a region of your brain that seems to have the primary function of taking your 30-second short-term memory window and transferring it into long-term, storing it away for later. If your hippocampus is damaged, you'll essentially live in a 30-second window of time without the ability to transfer that into long-term memory. So you won't remember what you've done over the course of a day. You can sort of carry on a conversation if the conversation lasts 20 to 30 seconds, but you can never really get that further. You'll often see yourself repeat questions in a conversation because after 30 seconds, the previous aspects of that conversation kind of vanish. Consider the hippocampus your save button. I've embedded a video here. So whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're watching this on Google Classroom, please watch this video all 3 minutes. It is probably the most heartwarming video I can show you all year. You might go back and watch it a second time. You might show your parent or guardians and your friends. It really pulls at the heartstrings. The gentleman in this clip, Clive Wearing, is a really famous case study, and he is still alive. But Clive has anterograde and retrograde amnesia. This is not super common, meaning he's lost basically all of his old memories. He can't form any new memories. So he lives in this 20 to 30 second window of time where he thinks he's come out of the void. He has no recollection of anything he's ever done in his life. And after 30 seconds, it just resets back to the beginning. So he can't suddenly relearn his life. But what's unbelievably fascinating about this is he has no episodic memories. They're gone. But he still has an emotional reaction to his wife, Deborah. So you will see in this clip that even though he has no recollection of his wedding or any life events, his episodic memories are blank, he still has some of the implicit memories, such as the emotional reaction to his wife. He also, might not be indicated in this clip, but if you put him in front of a keyboard, a piano keyboard, he was a world-renowned musician prior to his injury. He can actually still play the piano. So his procedural memory from motor skills, also untouched. So do please watch that 3-minute clip. I'm telling you, it's probably the best video I can show you all year. As a mnemonic, when I look at the word hippocampus, the word campus stands out. I always think about how you need good memory to go onto a college or school campus to do your classwork. So I see campus and I think classwork, and that's how I connect the hippocampus to memory. So the final one we're going to talk about is source amnesia over here on the right. This is the final box of the whole unit. I'm going to play a small portion, hopefully you can hear it, of a song. You may have heard of the song. It's called Toros by the band Spirit. I'm just going to play a few seconds of it. Hopefully it comes through well. I'm not going to play a second song. It's a way more well-known song. It's Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. I just want you to listen and judge whether or not you think the songs are similar. So regardless if you think those songs are perfect copies of one another, the band Spirit certainly thought Led Zeppelin copied their music and actually sued them for copyright infringement. Now, I'm not saying that Led Zeppelin had ever heard that previous song, the Spirit song, before, but it's conceivable that at some point in the life of the musicians in Led Zeppelin, that they did in fact hear sort of that slow beat at the beginning of the song and use that as an inspiration for their way more famous Stairway to Heaven song. This could potentially be what we call source amnesia. Now, source amnesia itself is not some type of like diagnosis. It's more of a phenomenon. But source amnesia occurs when you're unable to remember where you learned something. And that can be really detrimental when you're, for example, writing a paper. You might find yourself accidentally plagiarizing something that you heard in a YouTube video or heard during a lecture, not realizing where you actually definitively learned that information. If I ask you, where and when did you learn how to tie your shoes? You might have a general idea, but you can't definitively pinpoint when or where that happened. If you expand that into something like what inspired you to write that song, you might unknowingly be pulling from previous songs that you've heard, and as a result face a copyright claim like the Led Zeppelin song did just a few years ago. The band Spirit sued Led Zeppelin for copyright infringement, claiming that they copied sort of that slow build-up and routine at the beginning of the song.